Good evening, and thank you for joining New York Jewish Week and UJA-Federation of New York for our monthly Folio literary series. I'm Thea Wieseltier, Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, the parent company of New York Jewish Week. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome historian and author Pamela Nadell to our stage. Pamela will be in conversation with Andrew Silow-Carroll, JTA's editor-at-large, to discuss Pam's new book, Antisemitism, an American Tradition. Together, they will take a deep dive into the roots of anti-Semitism in the United States and the ways that Jewish communities have resisted hatred and bigotry since colonial times. Our partner, UJA-Federation of New York, knows that in an age of rising anti-Semitism and hatred, their work has never been more needed and more nuanced. They are focused on physical safety through their Community Security Initiative. They advocate for funding at federal and state levels. Beyond physical safety, we must ensure our way of life and our right to be proudly Jewish without fear or intimidation in our home, communities, on college campuses, and beyond. To learn more about UJA's work, please visit their website. The link is in the chat. And now to our program. Professor Pamela Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program. Her book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the 2019 National Jewish Book Awards Jewish Book of the Year. The Wall Street Journal named Antisemitism, an American Tradition to its best book list of October. Hadassah Magazine and Religion News Service put it on their list of best books of 2025. To Pam's chagrin, she is probably best known for testifying before Congress in the hearing with the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Pam.
Thank you. Thank you, Thea.
Thanks so much, Thea. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here again with Professor Nadell. We had the pleasure of speaking last year for an article in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. A lot has happened since then, and I want to recap that a little bit because since we spoke, we had the incident in Jackson, Mississippi. The historic Bethel Synagogue was set on fire in January by this month by an arsonist. We had the Bondi attacks in Sydney, Australia, where 15 people were killed during a Hanukkah celebration. Before that, there was Boulder, where there was a firebombing at a pro-Israel march, injured multiple people. And then, of course, Washington, D.C., that's less than a year ago, deadly shooting outside the Capitol Jewish Museum, claimed the lives of 2 Israeli staff members. So we can't escape this. But something you said when we were just speaking briefly a minute ago is intriguing, and I want to share with the audience that you said you never planned to write about this topic, despite its persistence. And I'm curious what you meant by that and what brought you to change course, if that's what it was.
First of all, thank you so much, Andy, for being in conversation with me and for that, so upsetting rundown of the violent incidents of the past moment. I would actually probably add what's being reported out of Josh Shapiro's memoir. That he was asked during the hearing if he had ever been a double agent for Israel when he was being vetted as a vice presidential candidate, because it just shows the breadth and depth of the anti-Semitic canards that are out there and that have infiltrated so much of our society. I never thought I would write this book. And then this is not a post-October 7th book. I worked on it for only 6 years, which is not a long time for a historian. And it's really a post-Tree of Life book that, just as the murder of 11 people at worship on October 27th, 2018 in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue building led to a shock that still rattles the Pittsburgh Jewish community and all of Pittsburgh, frankly, it also stunned a small group of us who are American Jewish historians. And we began having conversations. How had we missed this story? And that's what sent me down into the rabbit hole that led to writing this book.
It's it's right in your subtitle. It's an American anti-Semitism. Is there something distinctly American as opposed to just an import from years of Jew hatred in Europe?
First of all, let me emphasize that it is not a subtitle. It's after a comma and not after a colon.
Okay.
Because we writers, as you well know, subtitles get completely lost. So
Uh-huh.
anti-Semitism and American tradition was making a very deliberate statement that we have all sorts of traditions in this country. We're living through one at the moment where the nativism has cropped up its ugly head, frankly,
Mhm.
once again, that we have many, many other eras in American history. And I wanted to show that it courses throughout American history, but of course, it is distinctly different because we never had the level of violent state-sponsored anti-Semitism that we saw, for example, in the Holocaust or in the Inquisition or the expulsion of Jews from Spain. So there's definitely a difference, but it doesn't mean that it's insignificant.
Right. I'm thinking that before, let's say, the Civil War era, it was kind of an anti-Semitism without Jews in a sense. I mean, it's not a huge community,
Right.
neither in New York or, certainly during the Civil War when, Grant's famous. So let's talk about that era and what made it distinct in terms of the kinds of things that were said and done to Jews.
What makes the era distinct from the moment the first 23 Jews land in New Amsterdam, before it's even called New York, in 1654, is that the governor, Peter Stuyvesant, I know there's a high school in New York named for him that a lot of Jews ended up going to, but Stuyvesant wanted to expel the Jews. So his solution to what was the Jewish problem of the moment was the same solution that the Spanish had taken in kicking out the Jews in 1492. The difference was that he didn't make colonial policy, and the company that did in Amsterdam told him he couldn't do that.
Mhm. And that was theological. What was his objection to the Jewish community then?
His objection actually had so many of the classic components of anti-Judaism. Remember, we don't have the word anti-Semitism at that point in time.
Mm.
He wrote about that he wanted to get rid of this, and I'm going to quote, this deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. But then he also continued because he talked about them as usurers, which comes from the Middle Ages. He talked about them as being deceitful traitors with Christians. He talked about them infecting the New Amsterdam colony if they stayed, echoing the idea of Jews carrying disease that we saw in the Black Death in the 14th century. About the only thing he didn't raise was the blood libel, but many Christian ministers raised that.
I'm fascinated that, like you said, we didn't have this tradition of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. And in some ways, there's a give, the state gives, then individuals take away. And I guess the earliest, most startling, and most welcome bit of giving was Washington, when he basically says this country is a country where, tell us all about the Toro Synagogue and what that meant in terms of the history of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism.
Right, which is a word that we begin to use now, but we didn't use so much before. The first thing to say is there definitely was state and federal sponsored anti-Jewish policies, but they were not violent the way we saw in
Okay.
Europe. That's the first thing to point out. But we
For
did
example, what
there restrictions, for example, in colonial times and also in the early states, restrictions that you had to swear an oath to Jesus if you wanted to hold office. When we look at the immigration restriction legislation of the early 1920s, clearly was targeting Jews. We can see that in the congressional reports. So there's definitely places where laws are passed that are going to deeply impact and affect Jewish life. Um, but I'm glad you asked about the Washington letter because I think the first thing to say is that this is not a new history of America's Jews. America's Jews is in terms of the Washington letter, is this moment where Jews are told that no longer will they be tolerated as it's done in Europe, but rather that they are full-fledged citizens of America, and that this is a country which gives, and quote, to bigotry no sanction. And that's a promise that is held out. By the way, Washington wrote about around 20 letters to different congregations, including others to a group of Jewish congregations. But this, of all his letters to religious groups, remains the most important and the one most widely quoted.
Mhm. And then, not, I don't want to skip too much of American history, but does the promise of to bigotry no sanction play out over, let's say, the next 100 years before we get to the immigrant era?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the issue is that we begin to see in this. I'll give you some examples from the Civil War. It is a country that gives to bigotry no sanction. So during the Civil War, when it's clear that Jews are not allowed to become chaplains because chaplains must be members of a Christian faith, that law gets changed. But we also have the example in the Civil War of Ulysses S. Grant doing what Stuyvesant never succeeded in doing, and that is he kicked the Jews out of the military district that he controlled. But then Lincoln countermands it. So we have, I liked your phrase earlier about push and pull. I think we have these moments where Jews are confronted with anti-Jewish acts, and they also respond very vociferously.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about the response because, Jews are not just victims or subjects of this; they are active players. At what point do we start having a kind of organized, representative, a pushback, really? Jews organizing as Jews to say, we will not accept this.
We begin to see it in the US, and you're right. The American Jewish community is not even 250,000 on the eve of the Civil War. It's a tiny community. And actually, at the end of the Revolutionary War, it's about only 2,000 Jews.
Mm.
And we begin to see collective action at the moment where there's enough Jews in certain cities to act together. And what galvanized them was in 1840
Mm.
when it was known as the Damascus blood libel, when a Capuchin monk and his Muslim servant disappeared. And the Syrians they immediately believed that the Jews must have done this because it was close to one of their holidays and they were going to need Christian blood for their holidays. And they arrested leading Jewish men, they tortured them, and it became an international cause celeb. And in the US, Jews begin to hold protest meetings and they get Christian clergy to join them. They begin writing letters in the newspapers and they write to the President of the United States saying, you have to do something about this. So they develop what I call an early playbook, a playbook that Jews still use today.
Mm. So we're gonna bump up against the immigration era. Begins around 1880. Massive amount of Jews coming from Eastern Europe for the most part, Ashkenazim. And this, I think, creates a different kind of backlash. And this is where nativism really becomes a force in the United States. So I know it's a long period and there are many differences between 1880 and 1920, but let's talk about the immigration period and what that meant.
The first thing to say is that there's a real fear that the Jews are taking over New York. And there are all sorts of cartoons that appear in satirical publications at that moment where you see, the Tsar with the whip driving the Jews with the packs on their back out to New York. And then the people who are leaving are people, and literally their names Schuyler and Van Beekman, and they're heading to the West. And there's a real fear about the Jews displacing the rightful Americans. If we get to talking about the replacement theory that we saw in Charlottesville, where the neo-Nazis were chanting, Jews will not replace us, I don't know if they knew that dated back more than 100 years. That's the first observation. So what it leads to is it leads to a movement for immigration restriction. And that movement for immigration restriction they form a league in the 1890s, and there's a straight line from that Immigration Restriction League to Henry Ford in 1920 in the Dearborn Independent, publishing The International Jew, a series of columns that he ran for 91 weeks, which Adolf Hitler admired and which sets the stage for the quotas in the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924.
Hmm. And in the same period, I just wrote about this last week. It was about the Kahila in New York. But again, the reaction of Jews who were not just, you know, content to be, passive victims, but they used what power they had to push back and fight back. Talk a little bit about maybe some of the, uh, I guess first it was German Jews who had the power, and then slowly it shifts to Ashkenazim who just had the numbers.
Right. I like that article very much. I'm so glad you mentioned it because nobody remembers what the kilo was,
Mhm.
but it was a response to the police commissioner of New York saying that, the majority of the criminals in New York City were Jews, and the Jews realized that they needed to organize. And you're right to point out that the Jews who had come from Central European countries earlier, including Germany, were more well established, and they were sort of caught in a bind because they're also being charged with trying to displace the rightful Americans, the white Americans who were the founders, saw themselves as the rightful founders of this nation. So if we jump back a little bit, on the eve of the era of Great Migration, in 1877, Joseph Seligman, who was an immigrant, a banker, a friend of Ulysses S. Grant, who was even offered the position of Secretary of the Treasury, he was turned away from a hotel because they had adopted a no Israelites policy.
Mhm.
Israelites was a nicer word for Jews that they used back then.
And that was in Saratoga?
Yeah, Saratoga
Yeah,
Springs, New
okay.
York, at the Grand Union Hotel.
Right. Um, I don't think we can leave this period without talking about Leo Frank and his impact on both American and American Jews.
And of course, it's so timely because the musical about the Leo Frank story, Parade, played in New York a couple of years ago, and then toured around the country. May still be touring, for all I know, and quite unusual to make a musical about a lynching.
Right.
And Leo Frank was a Northerner, college educated, who went to Atlanta and to run a family member's pencil factory. And he was accused of having murdered one of his workers on Confederate Memorial Day in 1913. And his trial was such a circus that had he not been convicted, he would have been taken out and lynched. That was what all the reports said. His mother wrote to the Washington Post about how much her faith was attacked during that trial, not only her son. His lawyer said that had he not been a Jew, he never would have been convicted. They never would have gotten as far as it went. He was the only person who presented as white, who was convicted on the testimony of an African American ex-convict janitor. So he was convicted in 1913, sentenced to death. In 1915, on the day he was to have been executed, the governor of Georgia became convinced that there had been a miscarriage of justice, and he commuted Frank's sentence to life imprisonment. And a band calling themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan, the name of the little girl who had been murdered, pulled him from jail without firing a shot and lynched him. And that sent a legacy across Jews across America, especially Jews across Georgia and the South. I remember reading in a diary of a woman from the 1920s where she wrote, "Today was the day that Leo Frank was murdered."
Hmm. And then famously, and you can tell me if this is true, the Anti-Defamation League grows out of
It was
this event.
the Anti-Defamation League was founded in 1913 in the wake of the trial. But what's important to remember is that the Anti-Defamation League back then was not the Anti-Defamation League of today. It was essentially a group of men meeting in Chicago, and they would have monthly meetings, and they were trying to figure out how to respond to the anti-Semitism of the moment. And Jewish women in the National Council of Jewish Women, which already existed at that time, Jewish women would go into bookstores, and they would find whether or not the copies of Mother Goose carried this anti-Semitic rhyme, nursery rhyme, and they would tell the bookstore owners that they shouldn't sell those copies of Mother Goose. So that everybody was trying to do, and it has a lesson for today, right? Because they were trying to do whatever they could, even as something as small as saying, "Don't sell this book," to stem the tide of anti-Semitism.
I think then they're going to shut off the valve of immigration in 1924 with the Immigration Act. I don't think I understood growing up, and I certainly not until I started reporting on this, that how much Jews were at the center of the kind of nativist backlash that led to that piece of legislation. And I don't know if you were surprised at how much you found that tide. It was Southern Europe, Italians, Jews, and some other groups that certainly the Asians, Chinese, who had already been banned.
Right.
Talk about where Jews were in that debate and its impact on the community.
What stands out is that if you read the minutes of the Congressional Record, which I did, you see that the debate is clearly focused initially on poor East European Jews, especially those who have fled the wave of horrific pogroms. In the wake of the Russian Civil War, they had fled them from the Ukraine and ended up in Poland. And consular reports from Poland, and this is not 1924, it's actually 1920 and 1921.
Mhm.
They're claiming that if the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 is not passed, which did immediately begin to limit immigration even before the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, that if that's not passed, they're claiming 3 million Jews are going to come to America. There weren't 3 million Jews in Poland at that point, but they were not all going to come to America, but they viewed the Jews as poor, as unassimilable, as dangerous to American life. And we are at a moment where we see the same kinds of arguments being made about other immigrant groups and as reasons for deporting them.
In the hindsight of history, we look back at kind of World War II and America joining the war and liberating Europe as sort of inevitable. But there was really, and your book goes into this, and other historians have also explored this in depth. There's nothing inevitable about America embracing the cause. And again, there was a lot of America, I mean, literally America first sentiment that they wouldn't be dragged into a Jewish war. How deep was the anti-Semitic sentiment on the with the rise of Nazism and on the eve of World War II?
It's really frightening to read the materials from those years. Historians have often called that period the high tide of American anti-Semitism, when Nazis, who are funded, by the way, by the Nazis in Germany, when Nazis were doing their best to infiltrate America and to turn it to the Nazi cause. And these Nazis shared the anti-Jewish animus of their German backers. And I mean, just to give you one example, in Hollywood, there was a plan that the Nazis, the Nazi Bund, German American Bund, had crafted, that they were going to kidnap 25 leading Hollywood Jews. By the way, they were going to include Charlie Chaplin, who was not Jewish, but he was a fellow traveler of the Jewish community.
Mhm.
They wanted to kidnap them, hang them, and plan to start a nationwide pogrom. And Jews were routinely in these years subject to violence in really shocking ways,
Mhm.
on the street corners, hearing these ideas about Aryan superiority.
the story also that comes down, and again, we need historians like you to tell us whether it's true or not, is that after the war, the shock of the extent of the destruction in the camps, of the murder, that this kind of ushers in a tolerant era, a golden age for Jews, where they just kind of get embraced into the, Protestant Catholic Jewish conception of America. And anti-Semitism goes into retreat, maybe for another 30, 40 years. Is that a good way to talk about the post-war period?
It's not how I would talk about it. I
Hmm.
call that era No Age is Golden.
Hmm.
Obviously, we're both thinking about Franklin Foer's wonderful Atlantic article about the golden age of American Jews is ending. It what happens is there are very, very important changes in really in the second half of the 20th century, and they don't happen in 1947. I think everyone remembers the movie Gentleman's Agreement or Laura Z. Hobson's book, and how it made anti-Semitism unfashionable. It exposed anti-Semitism in America in terms of restrictions from hotels, inability to get jobs, being unable to rent apartments. And that's true. But the fact that we needed that movie, that was the key anti-Semitism movie. And things don't change immediately. In fact, one of the things that I was able to discover is many of the pro-Nazi groups, neo-fascist groups that had been outlawed after the Japanese attacked the U.S. in Pearl Harbor, those groups almost immediately reemerge, and they're making the same kinds of anti-Semitic claims, and also, by the way, racist claims, anti-Black claims that they had made earlier. What changes is that federal legislation and state legislation is passed that makes limiting employment to certain groups. Fair housing laws are passed. And ultimately, the U.S. 1964 Civil Rights Act is the really transformative moment. And after that, the quotas against Jews being admitted to colleges fall, as well as the restrictive covenants that said that Jews cannot live in certain neighborhoods. Those are declared by the courts unenforceable. So it's not 1947, not even 1950. It's a gradual process of change that leads to the end of many of the structural limitations, but the reality is anti-Semitic violence continues.
Hmm. We're drawing to the end of this lightning tour of American Jewish history. I feel, again, there's a book if you want to read it, and I think it was written by you. So I don't want anyone to think I'm giving short shrift to any of these periods, but I want to kind of get the span of it before we ask more questions. I think about some of the contemporary manifestations. Israel is founded in 1948. It kind of burst really into both American and general consciousness, American Jewish and general consciousness after the 67 war. But which is a moment of great pride for Jews and great acceptance of the Jews. But eventually there's a souring. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how Israel itself gives and takes away. It gives Jews a great moment of pride, but it also gives a cudgel for some anti-Semites to beat the Jews with.
I think what people don't remember is that the idea that one could be anti-Zionist and then claim that, of course, they were not anti-Semitic comes straight out of the Soviet Union. And
Mm.
and we see, for example, the Soviet Union during the Cold War in 1960 trying to disrupt things by starting a swastika campaign. And they started in West Germany, and it spreads to the United States. It even spreads all the way to Israel. And the notion that anti-Zionism is a legitimate expression, and I'm not talking about opposition to the policies of the
Mhm.
government of Israel. I'm really talking about his opposition to the existence of the state of Israel. That has deep roots in first the Soviet Union, and then it's essentially exported to the United States, so that even as early as you mentioned the Six-Day War and how that galvanizes American Jews, but it also galvanized opposition to Israel, and we see it starting first with the Black Power movement, then we see it spreading more widely.
Mhm. So I guess your job as a historian is to tell us how the past can inform the present. I mean, that's part of what you do. Um, when we make these distinctions between anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, is there anything useful from your field that can help people make that distinction in their own mind? Because it's probably one of the most confusing things right now, both for people on the street and in legislatures. So
Right.
what's the distinction that you draw between anti-Zionism, pro-Palestinianism, and anti-Semitism?
For me, the distinction is what I mentioned before, which is that when anti-Zionism, opposition to the existence of the state of Israel, crosses that line, and when for example, anti-Zionists use ideas about Zionism as racism. 1975, the United Nations passed that resolution. When they equate Jews with Nazis, so they're using Nazi symbols to talk about the Jewish state and Israelis, that we have really like crossed some line to anti-Semitism. And I understand that it's confusing and it's difficult. Some scholars are now talking about anti-Zionism as being adjacent to anti-Semitism, but its own unique form of prejudice and hatred. That's another way of considering it. But in the end, it's targeting Jews. And I think the most important thing to remember about anti-Zionism is, what does it lead to? The Soviets' anti-Zionism led to the emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of them leaving and going to Israel, some to America. What happened in North Africa and the Middle East? Anti-Zionism led to the expulsion or the flight of some 700, 800,000 Jews from all of the countries of North Africa and from the Middle East. So anti-Zionism has a deep impact on Jews, whether or not it is considered anti-Semitism.
Mhm. You mentioned at the beginning, just this week, Josh Shapiro complained, excuse me, that he had been in the vetting process for the vice presidency. He had been asked if he had been an Israeli agent. And again, that raises the dual loyalty charge, which is only possible when you have a state of Israel. And the charge basically posits that the Jews have more loyalty to this foreign country than they do to their own. Or, given when push comes to shove, they would throw in with their people rather than their, adopted country. I guess the roots of that go back to Jonathan Pollard, and I remember that causing Jews to panic. But also, let's talk about, how do we negotiate that? How did Jews remain, deeply invested in Israel without triggering this awful charge that they're a fifth column?
Right. The first thing that I would say is, I don't think you needed Israel to have the dual loyalty charge.
Hmm.
Because if we think about the protocols of the elders of Zion and the charge that the Jews are more loyal to their people than they are to any particular state. So the notion of sort of this, you're using the phrase fifth column. I'm thinking of Jews being, the Jews' primary loyalty is to their people, and that they're using that loyalty to take over the world. And, in various different iterations that we read about in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion from the early 20th century. I'm not sure how to combat that, but it is, I can give you all sorts of examples of Jews who have been loyal citizens of their states and who have not put their attachment to Israel and to 45% of world's Jewry. I mean, let's remember, 45% of the Jews in the world today live in Israel. Their attachment to that doesn't compromise their primary loyalty to their nation. After all, Governor Josh Shapiro swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the U.S. and of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. To have been asked during the vetting process, had he ever been a double agent for Israel, suggests that the person who was doing the interviewing was either utterly clueless about what she was saying, or that she actually believes this dual loyalty charge.
Mhm. I'm going to remind our viewers now, if they have a question for Professor Nadell, they can put it in the Q&A. And we already have one, which I want to ask you about because I know it's on the mind of a lot of our viewers, which is the election of Zohran Mamdani in New York. Again, if we're talking about the difference between anti-Zionist, which he is, and pro-Palestinian, which he is, and anti-Semitism, that's the debate. Did you see something in the lead up that either fit into a historical pattern that you were familiar with or represented something new and unexpected for American Jews?
What was new and unexpected for American Jews is that, the second largest Jewish city in the world, New York after Tel Aviv is my assumption, elected a mayor who, while I completely understand how excited people were about his promises about making the city more affordable, a figure whose opposition to the state of Israel is really calling for its destruction, its end. And I wasn't surprised. What I was surprised by was that 1/3 of New York Jews reportedly voted for Mamdani. I met a lot of them. I happened to be in New York on book tour and was talking to people, so I met quite a few who were. And I think, I'm not positive about this. I sort of imagine that this is a little bit like when Hitler became chancellor, and that people thought that his rhetoric would be toned down once he was dealing with the realities of power. And what stands out to me is that at the Park East Synagogue, when there was a demonstration about, and some Jews were going into the synagogue because of for a meeting for a group that promotes Jews moving to Israel. And it's one thing that they were demonstrating for Palestine, but they also called, "Let's make them scared." And that to me crossed the line. If anybody did that outside an African American church, if white nationalists yelled that outside an African American church, wouldn't everybody say they're absolutely racist?
Mhm. It's funny though, the solutions. I want to talk about anti-Semitism on the left and the right. That's its own topic, and we can talk about that. But one of my colleagues mentioned to me that so many of the solutions to both anti-Semitism on the right and the left are antithetic to many Jewish values. So the example that was given was on the right. They welcomed President Trump's, you know, putting it to universities to do a better job of protecting their Jewish students. But that represented sort of an attack on the academy, which you represent, in a way that was antithetical to Jewish values. And then on the left side, Jews have always been about free speech, free assembly, tolerance, immigration, and yet some of those are antithetical to their values of protecting themselves from. So I wonder if you've thought about that, and is this a pattern that Jews have to kind of like negotiate between who they are and what they need, what the outcomes that they want to achieve?
We live in a very difficult moment, as everybody on this
Yeah.
webinar certainly knows. What makes this moment for Jews so difficult, and in terms of balancing their values and also literally their own safety, is the way in which anti-Semitism has become weaponized, both on the right and on the left.
Mhm.
In the Harvard case, when as everyone knows, the Trump administration slashed hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars from research budgets. And the judge at one of the hearings in the Harvard case said, "What does canceling cancer research grants have to do with resolving anti-Semitism?" There's no question anti-Semitism is a real problem on the college campuses. And it's a problem because those who have the right to free speech and their free exercise of their behavior, what they're doing is they're shunning Jews. They're moving out of dorm rooms with, they don't want to live with, quote, a Zionist. They don't let Jewish students into their clubs and organizations. Jews, and also, by the way, Muslims, significant numbers, it's like 1/3, I think, have reported that they've lost friends since October 7th. And that's not, that behavior, that shunning behavior, reminds me both of what happened in the 1920s when Jews couldn't get admitted to schools and when they were also unable to work in so many places. That's kind of a parallel, but it's also something that can't be regulated by law. These are, social interactions, but they have huge impacts. So that's coming from it's coming from the left, but it's also inspired by the same kinds of ideas that the right has. So it's this kind of like almost coming full circle. Does that make some sense?
Mhm. What do you see in terms of, the Trump administration, again, offers a very mixed picture for Jews. On one hand, completely or mostly supportive of Israel. At the same time, there's a sort of courting of white supremacists or a tolerance for the Great Replacement and stuff. Did your in your history how far did you take it, and what were some of your conclusions about this moment in terms of intolerance on the right?
The first thing to say is until, and you mentioned the attack at the Capitol Jewish Museum in May, followed by the firebombing of those protesting to remind people about the hostages then still held in Gaza in June in Boulder, Colorado. The first thing that jumps out at me is that until then, the threat of anti-Semitism coming from the right, those were the people with the guns. I mean, that's what inspired my writing this book, What Happened at Tree of Life. Now, of course, we're seeing violence coming from the other side. But you're right that, and I just spent 12 days in Israel. I was talking about the book. I know Israelis love Trump because he got the hostages out. I totally appreciate that and understand that. But many are also aware of how dangerous the policies are. And what frightens me about using anti-Semitism to go after the universities, which, by the way, I was in, as Thea said, I was in that hearing with the presidents in December of 2023. That was the opening salvo in the attack on higher education, which leaders in the Republican Party had long before promised they were going to do. But using that to go after higher education, and which will, by stripping those funds away, will ultimately lose to the loss of preeminence of our colleges and universities in terms of medical and scientific research. People will remember in the future, if those schools lose their pride of place, that it was done in the name of the Jews. So it's very, very dangerous.
I want to turn to some viewer questions right now. And this is an interesting one. Can you discuss anti-Jewish sentiment in the armed forces in World War II?
Yeah, significant. There's a I there's a fabulous book by Joseph Benderly about anti-Semitism in the U.S. military. And one of the things that's happened since people heard about this book is people keep sending me stories, and many of the stories actually talk about what individuals faced during World War II when they were, for the first time, Jews who had grown up in New York or in, the Jewish neighborhoods of Boston or Philadelphia or Chicago. And now they're meeting lots of people from other places who are trying to figure out who they are. And I tell some stories about this in the book. Good
Hmm.
question.
Someone else says they live in Canada. Did you come across any fundamental differences between the American and Canadian experience? And this is actually, and maybe we can broaden the question to ask, have different democracies dealt with it in a different way where Jews have ended up since, the great dispersion of the first part of the 20th century?
The first thing to say is I did not write about Canada and I did not do any research on it. My field is the US, and it
Mhm.
probably would be better to have called it, anti-Semitism a US tradition.
Right.
So I recognize that. But my sense is, from what I know of Canadian Jewish history, is that that Canada also had an policy that was deliberately excluding Jews. Someone wrote a book called None is Too Many. And I don't know much about experiences of anti-Semitism in Canada, the way, for example, there were certainly very stark differences. I don't believe Canadian synagogues were bombed the way synagogues in the South were bombed during the Civil Rights Movement.
Mhm. Someone else asked you also to speak about the history of white Christian nationalism in the United States. And there's both the history and there's the present reality. So maybe we can start where we are now and move backwards. How big a threat are we facing and what are its roots?
I think there's a real threat coming from white Christian nationalism. I see calls for things like, I mean, even to the extent of that only male heads of household should be able to vote, that they talk about, they'd like to take away the vote that women hold. By the way, the misogyny, and this is a whole separate other subject because I wrote a book about America's Jewish women. Misogyny is unconscionable. But white Christian nationalism, the idea, I'll give you the contemporary example. What were the messages put out by the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, maybe? I forget which exact ones. I know one came from Hegseth and maybe Rubio. The other one came from the holiday messages this year were all invoking either Jesus Christ or our Savior. And that's not what followed in the wake of George Washington's letter, which was if this was a country that gave to bigotry no sanction, then it also didn't elevate Christianity above other faiths in the messages it sent to the people.
Mhm. Um, what is your reaction to someone? I'll ask the question, I think, nicer than they asked it. When we talk about the Jewish reaction and counter reaction and fighting back, there's also when Jews turn on each other. Did you talk about kind of like, the history of, what I'll call self-hating Jewry, right? Where one side accuses the other of kind of being outside the community because they either take a political or ideological stand that kind of divides the Jewish polity and leads to the kind of polarization we have right now. Is that part of the story also?
It's not something that I focused on, but I do think it's a very important part, not only of the contemporary story, but also of going back much further in history to understand that we talk about an American Jewish community and people count it differently, 6 million, 7 million, 8 million, sometimes more. There are multiple American Jewish communities. I've seen figures saying that there are more than 10,000 national Jewish organizations. And when we talk about the American Jewish community, often what we tend to refer to are the positions put out by legacy and mainstream organizations. I'd probably put JTA in there. And I understand that there are lots of different points of view. And there's no question, because I think what's underlying this question, there's no question that Israel is the great divide and that the distance from Israel among young American Jews is something that everyone who cares about Israel should be worried by.
Mhm. Someone asked, how effective are the ADL and something like the Blue Square Alliance and the American Jewish Committee in changing minds of the average American in the fight against anti-Semitism? And I guess the more general question is, has Jewish self-defense in, on balance been effective over the last century?
It's interesting to think about, has Jewish self-defense been effective? It definitely was effective in moments where, for example, I mean, now I'm going to go back to the American Jewish Committee in the 1920s when Louis Marshall was leading the charge and would take on legal cases, and he was a lawyer and he was able to fight back. But it's sort of like what I was talking about before. It's bit by bit, and that the mainstream legacy organizations of today are, I think, facing a very, very difficult moment, probably one of the most difficult moments in their histories, and they're grappling with how to respond. And the truth is, the American Jewish community is grappling with how to respond. One way it's been responding is by creating all sorts of new organizations. And by the way, also new research centers on anti-Semitism at many major universities.
Someone else asked, uh, when did Jews become white people? Which I think is a question people ask in terms of 1924. They were kind of the rabble coming out of Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. And at some point, and this goes into the college debate also, we became privileged white people who couldn't possibly have been, we couldn't be a disparaged ethnic group because of our power. Can you talk a little about that whole, when did Jews become white people notion?
The first thing to say is that for the far right, Jews are not white people, that they've actually played the greatest trick that the devil has ever played. This comes out of the work of the great racial justice writer Eric Ward. He says that in their eyes, Jews played the greatest trick the devil ever played because they made people think they're white. They're not really white. So that's the first thing. The second thing to say is that Jewish racial identity has long been ambiguous. And especially after the Holocaust, there was a move away from identifying the Jews as a distinctive race. And that then paves the way for thinking more about the Jews as presenting white and as therefore folding into the white majority, which is how we get to some of the attacks on white settler colonialists occupying Israel.
Right. Then just as a caveat, we should always say the Jewish community is not a monolith, and there are Jews of color and Asian Jews and Latino Jews. But I know that I know that debate is a hot one, and it's very relevant to the moment. Um, we haven't even mentioned the internet, which can be a cesspool, and I think it changed the entire notion of where anti-Semitism is and where it can be found. Is that a sea change that you found in your research?
It's a sea change that echoes the past. We know that when the printing press was created, the blood libels, which had mostly been the purview of the monks in the monastery, who were the ones who had the ability to read, that they all of a sudden the printing press let the blood libels circulate in ways that had never circulated before. We jumped to the radio in the 1920s and 1930s. Goebbels uses it to circulate anti-Semitism, and Father Charles Coughlin uses it in the US to circulate anti-Semitism. Then we get to the new technology of the internet and social media, and it is, your words, I think, a cesspool. It is the chief driver of anti-Semitism and also the chief driver allowing people like the shooter at the Tree of Life Synagogue to feel that he had a community and that they would back him in what he did. So it is very, very dangerous. While I am obviously a free speech advocate, I also do believe that we need some kind of regulation of the internet.
Mhm. And certainly moderation on the part of, the private purveyors of the X's and the Facebooks and all that. Short of. Um, Someone is asking if, and I think this might be the last question, but we'll see how long it takes. Like, from your looking back in the past, what gives you hope about either the American Jews, the American Jewish condition, or our neighbors, and and the better angels of their nature? What do you look for when you look at the past and say, you know what, I think I feel good about this country, or I'm in despair. Who knows?
The first thing that gives me hope is the Pew Research Center does this thermometer survey about how warmly Americans feel towards other religious groups, and the Jews always come out on top. I mean, it's striking. The majority of Americans have positive feelings towards Jews. The problem is that when we look at these various surveys that, for example, the ADL or the AJC do, where they look at how many anti-Semitic stereotypes people hold, and I think one of their measures is if someone holds 6 or more, They're, like a full-fledged anti-Semite, I would say. And even if that percentage is only 10% of the American population in a nation of 33 million people, that's a lot of people.
Hmm. So that is good news, because it's not, uh, if you, in my business, you don't come across that very often. I mean, people tend to be, I don't want to say hysterical, but people are very on their guard all the time. And I think what I found so useful about your book was it's there's nothing new under the sun. We've gotten through this, but what it took was both advocacy on the ground and support in the highest places of power. And I'm wondering if you think that that support is still there, in addition to just attitudes at the grassroots.
You and I think are thinking very similarly. I frame it often as vertical and horizontal alliances. So the vertical alliance is from the ground all the way up through the various levels of governmental power in the United States. And while I do have deep concerns about what's going on at the very top today, I am also hopeful that in many places there are those who are deeply concerned about anti-Semitism and trying to stop it at the state levels and elsewhere. But then I like to think about the horizontal alliances, which really go from the conversation you have with a neighbor all the way to the interfaith and progressive alliances and with others who share our concerns about hate broadly, not just about anti-Semitism. And I take a lot of courage from my students. I teach a seminar on anti-Semitism to first-year students, and a student who was either an immigrant or the child of immigrants, based on the way he spoke English, told me how he went home over Thanksgiving break and one of his friends started spouting anti-Semitic canards, and he stood up to him. And I thought, that takes so much courage, and that's what we need. Allies, even in that kind of small moment.
Well, it's always great to end on a positive note. The name of the book is An American Tradition, Anti-Semitism, comma, an American Tradition. And it's by Professor Pamela Nadell. There's a link to how to get the book in the chat. There's also a link to an event we're having right after this, adjacent, which is about the anti-Semitic attack in Jackson, Mississippi, and Southern Jewry in general. I want to thank Pamela Nadell for being with us. I want to thank Beryl Bessemer and Thea Wieseltier from our staff for their support. And most of all, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and being part of this Folio event. Thanks so much and good night.
Thank you. Good night.